So this topic is definitely been in ever more and more in the public domain. Narcissism has surfaced as one of the hot topics in all psychological, self-help, relational, divorce arenas where podcasts and articles are being written and support groups and all kinds of things. So, and it is not by chance that as autism and neurodiversity have emerged and become more, people more aware of those things, that it has simultaneously caused people to wonder about narcissism and neurodiversity. And as I got into it, this is like very much discussed in many places, and many about it said, oh my gosh, everybody's always asking me about this. So in that way, I felt a little like, oh, good that I'm getting into this because it's obviously a thing and I really should know more about it. So for my own benefit, I'm so happy that I got to begin to lean in. I don't think by any means things that I found out are done, but I've learned that there's quite a bit to learn and that the conversation is evolving, as it is with neurodiversity, as they're learning more about the brain and how the brain is wired and the influences of developmental challenges to how people present and how they function. And that's true with narcissism too, by the way. There are brain differences, which I didn't realize. I thought it was all nurture, not nature, but that's not true. So this month, our topic is neurodiverse or narcissist, or both. It's not an exclusive opportunity. Tonight, we're going to talk about neurodiversity as compared to narcissism, what is distinct and what is similar and what is, co-occurring, because they can co-occur. Though in the DSM-4, they could not. But in the DSM-4, autism couldn't co-occur with ADHD either, which, the skip over out of that and now into the DSM-5, which soon will be obsolete, is already obsolete in many ways. So after this evening, the other topics we're going to look at is some examples more fleshed out. Next week, we'll talk about how neurodiverse and narcissism can coexist and different scenarios where that might present, or different ways of thinking about it or even dealing with it on some levels. The third week, we're going to talk about the impact of the combination or deep trauma that comes from neurodiversity and or narcissism, in other words, trauma bonds, and the reality of that. And that is often how we experience these marriages on some levels. So again, it's helpful to know what am I just struggling with because of the neurodiversity, or what is in fact narcissistic behavior that is flat out destructive. And I need to be aware of the differences and stand up against any abuse. And then in the last week, I want to talk about the importance of dealing with the reality, of assessing the reality, of dealing with it, and how to deal with it, options for dealing with it. So that's what's coming. And I'm, as always, looking for any input, questions, information. If anybody has anything to contribute to this conversation, bring it as you come to on any evening. Give it to me in advance. I'm all ears to hear what you all have to say about it. So looking at neurodiversity, and many of us know a lot about neurodiversity, but what I sent you this afternoon was a very comprehensive list. It certainly lines out what narcissism is, and then it also lines out what autism is and what ADHD is. And then it talks about what the overlap is between narcissism and autism and narcissism and ADHD. So we have those two flavors of neurodiversity, autism and ADHD. And the reason I'm more and more convicted that they are often very much traveling together. Okay, not always, but it's important to know they can. And so let's talk about okay. The big difference between, this is a sort of global topic here. The big difference between somebody with ADHD and somebody with narcissism is that somebody with ADHD alone is really not having a malevolent nature. They're very rarely conscious to the extent that they've hurt somebody. All right. And that structure of their mind leads to a sense of peace in them, that they're not malevolent. They're not looking to power play, though it might not present that way to you. But the intention behind what they're after is more survival, more not to get into trouble. And when people who are neurodiverse really do realize they've hurt somebody deeply, they are capable of tremendous grief and empathy and compassion and remorse. And I've seen that. And they don't know what to do about it. It's very hard to know, oh my gosh, I've hurt somebody and I don't know when I'm going to do it again. I mean, what a horrible burden that they carry when they're truly empathetic and truly not wanting to hurt and wanting to do better, but not knowing how. A narcissist is actually not at all like that. A narcissist is malevolent. They're in it for their gain and your pain. And there might even be a bit of enjoyment of the chaos and disruption that they cause, because putting everybody else off foot puts them on the pedestal. It keeps them front and center, in control, center of attention. And that's what they're very symbiotic in that it's a sort of a parasitic relationship. They need others to magnify them and fortify them. Without others that they can control and they can lord it over, they don't have a sense of who they are. That is their mission in life. That is not the mission of an autistic person or an ADHD person. They're like, I just want to get to my job on time and not, be a total screw up, or I just don't want to lose my cookies and have a meltdown because I am too distracted by the light or something. There's a whole different motivation. People that are ADHD or autistic or ADHD are definitely, though, at a higher risk for developing personality disorders in general. And so that could include borderline personality. It could include obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which when you look at that one, it's like, well, isn't that autism? And it is very much like autism, but it's not the same. And then there's, of course, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. So there are a number of those. But statistically, people who are neurodiverse are more prone and more at risk to also develop a personality disorder. And personality disorders, interestingly enough, do not develop at birth. They are not present. They show up in the teens or early adulthood years is when you begin to see something is off, at least on a personality disorder, and narcissism in particular. Whereas we know that children at a very young age, as young as 3 months old, have already neurodiverse behaviors and traits and tendencies that can be noticed, and as early as 3 years can be evaluated with clinical accuracy. And maybe it takes a little bit longer for ADHD to show up, because usually it doesn't show up till there's rhythms and regulations and chores to do, and there's chaos because they're not processing and functioning in sync with what's expected, but much earlier than the personality disorder might show up. So I think I'm not going to go into all of the neuro differences in the brain, that happen with autism or ADHD, because there are hundreds, literally. It's no one thing. It's like many, many genes are different, and it's the combination of things and all kinds of things. But those are basically behavioral deficits, social behavioral deficits, communication deficits, and special interests and hyper focus and sort of inconsistency of attention. All right. And that presents in myriad ways. Executive functioning is under all of that, by the way. In narcissism, the brain differences, they actually have done scans that have shown that there are reduced connections between the frontal lobe and what's called the striatum. So that means certain cognitive abilities, judgment and decision-making, and reward registering parts of the brain, they have a weaker circuitry than in a typical brain. And so thinking positively about yourself is associated with those areas of the brain. And so it suggests that there's, when those parts of the connections are weaker, there's a greater need for affirmation from others as a way to compensate for the low activity that a more normative brain would be experiencing. Also, that when the imaging is done for a narcissistic brain, and there's testing for empathy, different parts of the brain light up for empathy, I guess. The narcissistic individuals exhibit a smaller and less active insular cortices compared to the typical brain, meaning their empathy centers do not light up much compared to a normative brain. So that's two things majorly. It's a sense of greater need for affirmation because your sense of self isn't affirming, and a lower amount of empathy. Ooh, so this is a very toxic combination. In the population, let's talk about our narcissism now. Some of the traits, the highlights I'll give you. And I'm just going to run down my list. It's, if you can go print that PDF I gave you. But I'm just going to try to run it down and give highlights. So 7.7% of men, but only 4.8% of women typically are presenting as narcissistic. Overall, it's about 6.2%, but more men than women. All right. And it still are pretty low numbers when you think that like almost 11% of people are ADHD. It's a very much higher percentage. It's a much lower percentage of people that are autistic. The over characteristics are a sense of grandiosity, living in fantasy about themselves. They can be bullies. Outwardly, they can be very abusive. They can be very controlling and demeaning and haughty and critical and I guess sarcastic, lots of verbal put downs, power plays. That is an overt narcissist. A covert narcissist is very dangerous. And maybe I would say of the two types, overt and covert narcissists, more covert narcissistic traits overlap with autism and neurodiversity. That's just my take on it, but I could be wrong. But the covert narcissist tends to be much more passive aggressive. Okay. And if they're abusive and controlling, it's hidden. They're not that way to everybody. They present very well in the world at large, at the corporation, on the pulpit, in the small group, as the elder, whoever, the grocery store clerk. But covertly, they are very toxic. All right. And they don't deal with things head on in the same way. They can be yes men on the front end and do their whole own thing on the back end. And I know that sounds like autism and ADHD, but again, the reasoning and the intention behind the behavior is very different. Okay. So cognitive empathy is working, meaning that they understand other people are hurting. They actually do. The question is, do they care? Relational empathy is not working. They do not care. And that is really hard to swallow, but that is what is true about narcissism. They can be very envious. They have a sense of entitlement. They do see validation, and they can be very superficial because they don't want to really present authentically, because that means being vulnerable, and that is not what they're about. They're egocentric and protective and defensive. They are deeply shame-based. There's no tolerance for shame, and they're very quick to blame others. Okay, so again, something to keep in mind is the length of fuse on somebody. Typically, neurodiverse people have a shorter fuse when they're overloaded with many things. They're overloaded with too much talking, too much light, too much change, too much relational demands. They're kind of maxing out. And now they're heading into a panic survival brain enemy mode state. And on top of that, when accused or challenged, because they're in a very depleted state, their rational ability goes out the window, and they can be very reactive out of a defensive maneuver. Okay, and that could erupt as anger. But we'll talk more about differences. Let me get through the list of narcissism first. But a couple of these I want to address already now, so that you know that as you're hearing about narcissism, I don't want you to be thinking, oh no, my husband's a narcissist, everyone should think, because there's some difference. So hold your horses here. Okay, so there is a deep feeling of inadequacy a narcissist has. And no matter what evidence they gather or demand, it's coming from this place of lack of sense of self and self-affirming thoughts or ability to affirm self. They can be very impulsive. They can be very deceitful, callous, insensitive, lying with no second thought. And again, autism, they can be very blunt, but they more often than not are not smart enough relationally to be that manipulative and lying. They can definitely lie. They definitely can. All right. And it can be a learned and honed craft for autism, but their general nature is not to be misrepresenting the truth. Sometimes they just are painfully adhering to the truth, and that can be annoying. Narcissists, more often than not, are adept at being extroverted or faking an extroversion that is very charming, very disarming, very manipulative, very subtle. Overtly, like I said, they can be very aggressive, ruthless. Rules don't apply to them. They don't even care to think of what the consequences are going to be, because they're just going to bully people. They're going to push and bully and traumatize, and everyone's so shocked that they don't know what to do about it. And the general posture is, I'm in control and you're not, and I'm demeaning to you, I dismiss you, I have even contempt for you, and if there's a problem, it's your fault. All right. Now, that's a sort of a hardcore, aggressive, overt, mostly narcissist. There is such a thing as a vulnerable narcissist. And ironically, these are mostly women, how they present with the narcissism. So these people can be very socially anxious, and they come up as unpretentious. They're not bullies. They're not trying to lord it over, but so they're not as showy. They're harder to spot, but they have a victim stance, well rehearsed, and it's in their bones that they are the victims. There's a grudging contempt for showy individuals, like, oh, that, she thinks she's so great with that new hairdo she has, or whatever. And there's a sullenness and a blame shifting also. A failure to take responsibility in seeing that they are maybe thinking of themselves as victims. And there's a ruminating rage. It's not coming at you, it's festering rage, smoldering rage, dangerous, calculating rage. And it's very passive aggressive. So that's I had never heard of a vulnerable narcissist, but I've actually met people like this. And again, if there is a type of narcissist that could maybe be more akin to sometimes how we see the presentation in autism in particular, it may be more the vulnerable traits, the covert and vulnerable narcissist. ADHD and overt narcissism tend to pair more, I think. All right, because they're more outward and they're not as internalized sometimes. But you've met one ADHD person, you've met one ADHD person. So some of the big differences with autism, of course, from narcissism, and let's just talk about autism in general. It, like I said, it presents at birth. You can see it by the time they're 3 months or 3 years old. 35 to 75% of people who have autism also test positive or diagnose for ADHD. And that's across men and women. Statistically, though, 89% of boys that are autistic are also ADHD, and only 16% of girls who are autistic are also ADHD. That's the numbers that I found. Those are always changing and evolving. I think that, you know, in addition to struggles they have with connecting with eye contact or knowing what to say and when to say it socially or being persuasive personalities, those skills are way down in the autism world generally. In the ADHD world, there's a lot more faculty and ability to be relational in a kind of conversational way. It's a different thing going on. They're not so socially, their social deficits aren't at all like it is with autism, but there is a restlessness of the ADHD brain, which is dopamine seeking and impulsive and can blurt things out. And that is, I'm going to talk now about attention. So there's the inattentive ADHD person who is just having trouble focusing when they need to focus. If they want to, they can be hyper attentive to videos or projects that they're doing and not be distracted at all. But it has to be of their timing and their choice when they do that. If they have to sit in a classroom or in a discussion, sometimes they're there, but they're just not listening. They're just not even hearing what you're saying, and they are kind of faking it. They're scattered and distractible and forgetful. That's the inattentive presentation. The hyperactive presentation of ADHD is very physically active sometimes, interrupting, no self-restraint. So they're waiting to solve the problem. They're agitated, impulsive, and restless. All kinds of ADHD, by the way, are very responsive to medication. And that's important to know because, again, autism is not responsive to medication, but ADHD and some of the things that cause ADHD in the brain, which is an imbalance of neurotransmitters, are responsive. It is responsive when you have, especially the stimulant class of medication, boost the brain functionality because it makes the neurotransmitters more receptive to the neurochemistry that's already being produced in the brain. ADHD people are very capable of learning to compensate for their deficits. They just have to have motivation. Autistic people are not as capable of compensating, even though they can learn, but they do have some of the mind blindness to a greater extent than ADHD alone. And there is so much overlap here, by the way. Again, these are all markers in concepts, but presentation I tell people it's an XYZ axis, and it's a constellation of traits that are uniquely like a snowflake presenting across the spectrums of autism, ADHD, and even OCD, other things, Tourette's and dyslexia are all in there at the same time with some people. Both the ADHD, ADHD person, autism, have a hard time coping with stress, and they are very much in their survival brain, in the flight, fright, freeze, fawn stages. Narcissists, strangely enough, are not that much in their survival brain. They're, I think Jim Wilder in his podcast with Stephanie and Dan, he talks about intelligent enemy mode. And this is where you see the narcissist, intelligent enemy mode. They are in control. They are calculating. They know what they're doing. They're not letting their emotions get in their way. They do get triggered. They can be very emotionally destructive and volatile and cruel, just cruel. But they can also be very restrained and calculating. And that is a sign of self-control on some levels. And then, of course, the lack of empathy, the lack of relational empathy means they don't care if they're hurting you. In fact, good, I'm glad I hurt you. And they even look for ways to lure their victims in, disarm their victim, disempower their victim, and then, go for the jugular. So that is what narcissists do. So important differences, all right? Autistic people and ADHD people typically have a lot of cognitive empathy, meaning they understand empathy, and they even have some relational empathy, meaning they care that they've hurt the relationship. They don't know what to do about it, but they care more or less. I would also say that by and large, if there's an introversion versus an extroversion, narcissists are going to come out way ahead on the extroversion scale, and autism, ADHD, much more on the introversion scale. So narcissists are looking to dominate, and autistic people are typically not. If they're just autistic ADHD, they're not. All right. They want to get by. They want to do what they're supposed to do. They want to maybe protect their sameness and their safety zone. But it's not like they want to rule the world or topple governments or, break systems or something. That's not where they're coming from. Any hurtful words they come out with comes from a lack of understanding of how what they say is going to hurt and land. Their intention is never to hurt, but the impact can be hurtful. And they can understand that, by the way. They can, if they're not in a place of such threat, and this is again where we're going to begin to talk about when does it bleed into narcissism? Because there is a lot more overlap than you would think. All right. And I think, by the way, we can all have narcissistic tendencies. Every one of us is capable of that. But whether it's an enduring, overriding tendency from, brain deficits, we can all behave very badly. All right. Ideally, we're all working on reforming as we see that behavior and repenting of that. A narcissist isn't going to see there's anything wrong with their behavior, which is why it's so difficult to actually work with them, because very few narcissists ever recover because they don't think there's anything that they need to recover from. That's the bottom line. Narcissism is something that needs to be recovered from. Autism, you can't recover. You can grow. You can continue to develop. And ADHD too, you continue to develop given the wiring, but it's not like you're going to recover from that. Narcissism, you want to work on that. And there's got to be a lot of cognitive developmental training, cognitive behavioral therapy, where they really have to understand and care to improve on a moral level. And the success rates are not high. In fact, there are very few stats on it because very few people present for therapy that are narcissists. So let's see, what else can I talk about that's different? When somebody that's autistic or even ADHD gets called out on a mistake they've made, they're going to more often go into anxiety and depression and withdrawal. They can get triggered. And again, if it's married to an overload of physiological, mental, emotional stressors that is happening to them, they can erupt in anger. They can. All right. They can have angry meltdowns. But a narcissist is always going to get angry. They are not going to get sullen and boohoo and woe is me and depressed. They're just going to go for your jugular and blame you. When they get caught in a mistake, it's going to be your fault and they're going to go after you. And they'll tell everybody else about it too. A narcissist and combination with just maybe ADHD, there is a neurobiological reason that ADHD is insecure and offbeat. It is, again, a desire for admiration and superiority that drives a narcissist's behavior. A narcissist, and listening now, conversation. So a narcissist can listen, but listen with the objective of demeaning, controlling, manipulating. Anything you tell them, they are going to use as arrows against you. It's not because they care. All right. They will twist and they will gaslight very readily. A narcissist will interrupt you easily because they really weren't listening with any intent to learn or understand ever. They listen with contempt and judgment. An ADHD person, on the other hand, or an ASD-ADHD person might be having a hard time understanding the body language, the syntax of the words, the context of what's being presented to them, the eye contact. Their communication deficits are myriad. And it does sometimes, you don't know when you're talking to, like, what is wrong with him? Why can't he listen? It also could be because of attention deficit. They're like thinking about 15 other things. And it's not like they have contempt for you. They're just distracted. So that's a big difference. All right. They're just having a hard time listening. Overall, there's an arrogance to narcissism. There's a malevolence, like I said, and there's a real danger in being in relationship with them because there's no way to win with a narcissist. It's never win-win. And it may start out as you've been charmed and courted. And again, this is similar to many of the ways we've been, presented the autistic ADHD guys. They're masking like crazy and doing all the great boyfriend stuff according to the script. And then they turn into somebody else on the wedding night. A narcissist is going to shrewdly woo you and win you over and over. There's a cycle. There's a cycle of the honeymoon cycle, the wooing, the drawing in, the abuse, the degradation of your personhood. You're in a pool, you're trying to escape, and now, let's go on the honeymoon again, and a drawing you back in. So we're going to talk more about that cycle and the love bondage, trauma bond or love bond, what is going on here. But that's kind of the thinking that gets that happening. It's coming from a malevolent, calculated, deliberate, don't let the prey get away. I think of a spider spinning webs around little flies that they're going to then suck the life out of. That's a narcissist. So, this is such a happy topic, isn't it? I am going to stop talking now.